Beginning last year, I kind of felt the urge to get away from my inkjet, even though I love my inkjet, to put the final works on paper. So I started experimenting with like pen plotting, which it's kind of like a cliche in like computer art, I guess, you know, because it was like one of the first ways of getting stuff to paper in general. So that's just something to be aware of. But anyways, the first piece I made was called Ant Thoughts, and it was basically a 2-pass drawing series with one pass drawn in pencil and the other one in ink to make like these compositions that kind of like felt like ant dreams to me. Or, I don't know, like that's basically where the title came from. And at the end of this, this was like one of the first initial tests I made, and at that point I really felt the urge to put my artistic hand back into the production of like the final art pieces, and I deliberately avoided that until that point because I felt it kind of diluted the computer-generated nature of my art pieces if I would add like anything hand-drawn. But at the time, I simply realized that the collaborative aspect that I mentioned earlier became like more and more important to me as something that I at least wanted to explore. And I'm still like, these are basically the baby steps into that direction. So there's still a lot to do, but that's kind of like what I'm up to right now. So following that, I basically made a second piece called Ant Thoughts 2. In the end, it's just, if you want to be mean, it's a glorified adult coloring book. So even though the drawings are still like generated through code, they're drawn in like multiple passes. So the initial composition is drawn in pencil by my pen plotter. And then I painted over it with acrylic. But I actually didn't add much. Like I added some details here and there, but mainly I just filled in the blanks and picked the colors. And then in a final pass, I would paint over the black detail that you can see here, and that also kind of connects it to the previous piece. And while I'm like extremely happy with the visual outcome of that series, you know, it definitely were like the first baby steps, only the first baby steps towards what I actually want to achieve. So I made like following that I made a second experiment called Disassembly. And this is an initial sketch I made for it. I think it says even what the work is, I don't know. I had a pretty clear idea from the start for that piece. The idea was basically that I would make drawings by hand and then have the computer basically take the drawing apart into all its individual pieces and assemble them in like a grid, basically. And in order to achieve that, I actually made all the drawings digitally, in Illustrator, similar to the initial sketch I showed, and then wrote custom software that would do the second step for me. So all of the works in that series consists of 2 prints, one of the digital drawing that I made by hand, and the other one, I basically drew it with a tablet just to clarify what I mean by hand. I used a tablet to draw on the computer. And the other print that basically is the original drawing disassembled into its individual parts. So this is one example. So the drawing on the left is what I drew by hand, and then on the right is basically the computer's view of all the individual parts disassembled. And all of the drawings in this series are kind of loosely based on certain like murder weapons. So this one was like loosely based on like a machete. This one was based on a hand grenade. And this one on a rifle. And Generally speaking, I feel like this is definitely also not where I want to end up yet, but it's another baby step into that direction. Because I think mainly I don't want to draw on a computer. I just did that as a first step towards where I want to end up. Earlier this year I made another series called Club Sandwich, which is another one of those baby steps. So the initial composition is computer generated by software I wrote, and then pen plotted onto canvas, and then I basically painted over it more freely in acrylic. And in the near future, I would basically, so it gets like very process oriented at this point, but basically there's like 2 steps now. So the computer does something, then I take that as like a reference point or as inspiration and add my 2 cents to it basically. But I would, in the next step, moving on from here, I would like to end up with a system where there can be multiple or infinite steps of those, so that it becomes more of a real dialogue and collaboration. That's not exclusively what I'm doing now, but it's definitely one of the major topics that's currently on my mind. So right now I'm working on a new drawing machine back in Los Angeles, which is basically going to be like an open source CNC, but I'm going to use it to draw on like thicker materials like stretched canvas and wood panels and stuff like that. Because with the pen plotter, I'm currently limited to thin materials that can feed through its paper feed mechanism, basically. Last but not least, I would like to show 3 other works I did this year that are purely computer generated. So I still do that, it's still important. So I made 2 series that were kind of like tributes to artists that I feel are important to me or influenced me. The first one is basically a series of, I actually forgot how many that were, 4 times, I guess 40, of 40 computer-generated fountain drawings. And the idea to me was like initially when I tackled this project was I wanted them to be drawn on Post-its because I really like the personal and volatile notion that Post-its have. For a couple of reasons, I didn't end up doing it on real Post-its in the end. The first reason is like I couldn't find any archival Post-its that wouldn't fade in like a matter of weeks. And the second reason is I think the common Post-it is like 3-inch, which felt too small. So these drawings are 6 by 6 inch, so they're basically twice as big as a Post-it. But that's kind of like where the colored paper idea came from. The second, these are bigger ones. So actually this was one of those projects where I was like, I should be done with that pretty quickly, but I spent way more time than anticipated because it's one of the first drawings where I actually dealt with some sort of, even though like very basic, but perspective that was less flat than most of the other stuff I computer generated before. And I was like, initially I thought, it can't be that hard to fake it, but actually to get it programmed in a way where it actually doesn't feel completely rubbish was surprisingly hard. But in the end, I was actually pretty happy with the final ones. The second series was from Mike Kelly's Candors, so it's like the same idea but on yellow paper, and instead of fountains, it basically draws candors, which is one of my favorite artworks by, I guess, Mike Kelly, who who is actually one of those people where I'm not entirely sure why I'm so in love with his work yet. I didn't really verbalize that yet, but he's definitely, every time I think about his work, it makes me happy. So they kind of look like this. For the people that don't know, Candor is like the city where Superman is from, and it's basically one of the most important bodies of work in Mike Kelly's body of work.